You know what they say about bad days? Well, Zara was having the kind of day that made a root canal look like a spa treatment. Picture this. You're a 7-foot-tall alien warrior with fur like midnight and claws that could open a can of whoop-ass, and somehow you've ended up chained to the cargo hold of the galaxy's most notorious slaver ship. Yeah, that kind of day. The chains weren't just regular chains, mind you. These were quantum-locked military-grade restraints that could hold a rampaging space rhinoceros. Overkill? Absolutely. But Captain Vex wasn't taking any chances with his prize catch. Speaking of Captain Vex, imagine a crocodile had a baby with a used car salesman, then that baby grew up to be a sociopathic pirate. That's Vex. 8 feet of scaly green arrogance wrapped in a coat that screamed I make terrible life choices professionally. He strutted through the cargo hold like he owned the universe, which, to be fair, he kind of did in this little corner of space. My beautiful kitty cat, Vex hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the recycled air. Still plotting my demise, I see. How delightfully predictable. Zara's yellow eyes could have melted steel. If looks could kill, Vex would have been vaporized 6 ways to Sunday. But the real kicker. Her 3 cubs were caged just 10 feet away, mewing pitifully behind energy bars that hummed with enough voltage to power a small moon. The flesh markets of Kepler-7 are going to love you, Vex continued, clearly enjoying himself. A mother and her babies? Oh, the bidding wars we'll have. I might just retire after this haul. The flesh markets. Even the name sounded like something you'd find in the dictionary under things that make you lose faith in sentient life. It was where the galaxy's worst came to shop for slaves, gladiators, and worse. Much worse. Zara had been a commander in the Filinar Defense Force before this nightmare began. She'd led battles against the Void Reapers, survived the Crimson Nebula campaign, and once killed a Titan-class war mech with nothing but her claws and an attitude problem. But none of that mattered now. Not when her babies were depending on her. The ship's engines hummed with the kind of confidence that came from never having been caught. The Crimson Fang was Vex's pride and joy, a modified battlecruiser that could outrun anything the Galactic Patrol threw at it. Its hull was scarred from a dozen firefights, and its reputation was darker than a black hole's event horizon. 2 more days to Kepler-7, Vex announced, checking his chronometer. Try not to die of despair before then. Dead merchandise doesn't fetch nearly as much. As he slithered away, Zara tested her chains for the 1000th time. Still locked. Still hopeless. The cubs whimpered again, and she felt her heart break a little more. She'd failed them. Failed as a mother, failed as a warrior, failed as everything that mattered. But somewhere in the depths of space, a small maintenance vessel was changing course. And aboard that vessel, a human named Jake Murphy was about to prove that sometimes, the galaxy's biggest underdogs bite back. Now, if you've never seen a human before, you might think Jake Murphy was exactly what you'd expect from Earth's supposedly primitive species. Average height, brown hair that looked like he'd stuck his finger in a light socket, and the kind of face that screamed, I fix things for a living and probably know way too much about obscure mechanical trivia. He wore a standard maintenance jumpsuit covered in enough grease stains to suggest he actually did maintenance work, and carried a toolkit that looked like it had seen more action than a war correspondent. But here's the thing about appearances in space, they're about as reliable as a politician's campaign promises. Crimson Fang, this is maintenance vessel Rusty Wrench requesting permission to dock, Jake said into his comm unit, his voice carrying just the right amount of bored professionalism. Your hyperdrive's been throwing error codes across 3 sectors. Somebody's gonna notice if you don't get that fixed. On the bridge of the Crimson Fang, Captain Vex rolled his reptilian eyes so hard they nearly fell out of his skull. Humans, he muttered to his first mate, a bug-eyed creature named Skrit. Soft primitive meatbags who think they understand real technology. Should we vaporize him, Captain? Skrit asked, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. No, you insect-brained moron. If our hyperdrive actually is malfunctioning, we need it fixed before we reach Kepler-7. Besides, what's one pathetic human going to do? Bore us to death with talk about his feelings. Permission granted, Jake docked his ship with the kind of casual precision that suggested he'd done this dance before. A lot. As he stepped aboard the Crimson Fang, he made a show of checking his diagnostic pad and muttering about quantum flux readings and temporal displacement coefficients. Welcome aboard, meat creature, Vex sneered, looming over Jake like a particularly unpleasant skyscraper. Fix our hyperdrive quickly. We have a schedule to keep. Jake looked up at the towering reptile with the expression of someone who'd seen scarier things in his morning coffee. No problem, Captain, just need to run a full diagnostic. Mind if I poke around? These older models can be tricky. Older models? Vex's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. This ship is state-of-the-art Saurian engineering. Oh, absolutely, Jake nodded enthusiastically. Real nice craftsmanship. They don't make 'em like this anymore. Probably because they figured out better ways to do things, but hey, classic is classic, right? As Jake wandered off with his toolkit, supposedly heading for the engine room, his eyes took in everything. Security camera positions, guard rotations, the location of every blast door and emergency system. And when he passed the cargo hold, he heard something that made his jaw clench despite his casual expression. The sound of cubs crying for their mother. Jake Murphy had what you might call a very particular set of skills. Not the kind they teach you in maintenance school. Mind you, more like the kind you pick up when you've spent the last 5 years liberating slaves from ships exactly like this one. He started small, because that's how you avoid getting spaced before lunch. A little creative rewiring in the environmental controls. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make the air recyclers work a tiny bit harder. The kind of thing that would show up as a minor fluctuation in 3 or 4 hours. "Hey Bug Eyes," Jake called out to Scrit, who was supervising him with all the intelligence of a particularly dim light bulb. "Your oxygen scrubbers are running hot. When's the last time you changed the filters?" Scrit clicked his mandibles in what might have been confusion. "Filters? What are filters?" "Oh boy," Jake muttered, making a note on his pad. "That explains the smell. Tell you what, I'll throw in a filter change free of charge. Consider it a public service." While Scrit watched him work, Jake was actually rerouting power conduits and installing some very special modifications. The beauty of working on alien ships was that most species assumed humans were too stupid to understand their advanced technology. They never bothered to watch what you were actually doing. 20 minutes later, Jake was in the navigation room, ostensibly checking the hyperdrive's connection to the nav computer. The guard, a hulking brute named Gorthak, was busy picking his teeth with what looked like a small sword. "You know, Gorthak," Jake said conversationally, "your captain mentioned you guys are headed to Kepler 7. Nice place. I hear the seafood's terrible but the slave markets are booming." Gorthak grunted. "Captain says we got prime merchandise this time. Some cat warrior and her spawn. Gonna make us rich." "Cat warrior, huh?" Jake's voice stayed perfectly level but his hands moved a little faster. "Sounds dangerous. Hope your holding cells are secure." "Hey, nothing escapes the Crimson Fang's brig. Those quantum locks could hold a supernova." Jake nodded thoughtfully as he finished his repairs. The quantum locks were indeed impressive. Good thing he'd spent 3 years learning how to hack them from a reformed slaver who'd found religion. Funny how many criminals developed a conscience after humans started making their lives complicated. By the time Jake reached the cargo hold, he'd already planted 17 different surprises throughout the ship. The security system would start glitching in about an hour. The artificial gravity would begin fluctuating shortly after that. And the automatic doors would develop a very inconvenient tendency to open and close at random intervals. But first he had a mother to meet. Zara looked up as the human entered, her yellow eyes blazing with a mixture of hope and suspicion. She'd heard the stories about humans. Of course. Weak, emotional creatures who cried at the drop of a hat and probably couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag. "Ma'am," Jake said quietly, keeping his voice low so the guards wouldn't hear. "I'm Jake. I'm here to get you and your kids out of this mess." Zara's ears flicked forward. "You're human. Last time I checked." "Yeah, I know what you're thinking. We're not exactly known for our combat prowess. But here's the thing about humans that nobody seems to understand." Jake's eyes hardened, and for a moment, Zara saw something that made her reconsider every story she'd ever heard about his species. "We're really good at holding grudges. And slavery. Well, let's just say we take that personally." As if to punctuate his words, the lights flickered overhead. Jake checked his chronometer and smiled. "Right on schedule. Things are about to get interesting around here." The first sign of trouble came when Ensign Blurk, a particularly dim-witted member of Vex's crew, suddenly found himself floating upside down in the corridor. The artificial gravity had decided to take a coffee break, and Blurk was spinning like a very confused, very green pinwheel. "What in the 7 hells of Zorvak is happening?" Captain Vex roared from the bridge, his claws scraping against the metal deck as he fought to stay upright. The gravity fluctuated again, sending half the bridge crew bouncing off the ceiling like demented rubber balls. "Captain," Scrit's voice crackled through the comm system, which was now producing a delightful mix of static and what sounded like ancient Earth disco music. "The human, he's done something to our systems." Vex's reptilian brain, which was admittedly not the sharpest tool in the shed on a good day, finally connected the dots. "Find that meatbag and turn him into space dust." But Jake was already 3 steps ahead. He'd spent the last 20 minutes turning the Crimson Fang into the galaxy's most dangerous funhouse. The lights weren't just flickering anymore. They were strobing in a pattern that would make a rave jealous. The automatic doors had developed a personality disorder, slamming shut on anyone who tried to pass through them, then opening again with what could only be described as mechanical laughter. "Computer," Vex snarled, "locate the human intruder." "I'm sorry, Dave," the ship's AI replied in a voice that definitely hadn't been programmed with that particular Earth reference. "I'm afraid I can't do that. Also, your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries." Jake had been very thorough with his modifications. In the cargo hold, Zara watched in amazement as her quantum locks suddenly clicked open. The human had somehow managed to hack the most secure restraints in the galaxy while having a casual conversation about oxygen filters. Her cub's cage doors swung wide, and the little ones bounded toward her with mewing cries of joy. "Stay close to Mama," she whispered, gathering them protectively as the sound of boots thundered through the corridors. "Things are about to get very loud." She wasn't wrong. The first group of Vex's crew to round the corner and spot Jake got a crash course in why humans had survived to become a spacefaring species despite having no natural weapons, armor or apparent survival instincts. What they did have was creativity, stubbornness, and a disturbing willingness to use improvised weapons. Jake had fashioned a rather impressive club from a piece of the ship's own hull plating, and he wielded it with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious experiences. The first alien to reach him, a hulking brute named Gorthax, discovered that humans might be squishy, but they hit a lot harder than expected. "Surprise!" Jake shouted, bringing his makeshift weapon down on Gorthax's skull with a satisfying clang. "Turns out we're not as harmless as we look." The second attacker, an insectoid creature with way too many limbs, learned that humans also had excellent pattern recognition. Jake had noticed that most aliens kept their vital organs in roughly the same places, so a good old-fashioned knee to the thorax worked wonders across species lines. But the real show started when Zara joined the party. 7 feet of furious feline warrior, freed from her chains and righteously angry about the whole enslaving her children thing, was a sight to behold. Her claws extended with metallic snicks, and her first swipe opened up an alien from shoulder to hip. "Nobody," she snarled, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding troops in battle, "touches my cubs." The corridor became a whirlwind of violence. Jake fought with the scrappy determination of someone who'd learned combat in back-alley bars and asteroid mining colonies. Zara fought with the lethal precision of a trained warrior, who'd finally found something worth killing for. Between them, they carved through Vex's crew like a hot knife through butter. The ship's PA system crackled to life, and Vex's voice echoed through the corridors, now tinged with the kind of panic that came from watching your supposedly easy payday turn into a complete disaster. "All hands to the cargo bay. Kill the human, recapture the cat. And somebody please explain to me why the ship's computer is now playing Earth music and calling me Dave." The lights went out completely, plunging the ship into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the blood on the walls look even more dramatic. "Jake," Zara called out, her night vision allowing her to see perfectly in the dim light. "There are more coming." "Good," Jake shouted back, hefting his improvised weapon. "I was just getting warmed up." The next wave of attackers rounded the corner to find Jake and Zara standing back to back, surrounded by the groaning remains of their predecessors. The cubs huddled safely behind their mother, watching with wide eyes as the human and their mama showed the bad aliens what happens when you mess with a family. "You know what your problem is?" Jake asked the approaching enemies conversationally. "You assumed humans were weak because we're emotional. But here's the thing about emotions. They're not a weakness, they're fuel. And right now, I'm running on premium." The battle was about to get a whole lot more interesting. What happened next could only be described as a masterclass in controlled chaos. Jake had spent years studying alien psychology, and he'd learned that most species had one fatal flaw. They assumed that because humans looked weak and squishy, they'd fold under pressure. This was roughly equivalent to assuming that because a grenade looked small and harmless, it probably wouldn't blow your face off. "Zara," Jake shouted over the sound of blaster fire and dying aliens. "Escape pods are 3 decks up. Can you carry all 3 cubs?" "I'm a mother," Zara replied, her claws dripping with the blood of anyone stupid enough to get between her and her children. "I could carry them through the fires of hell itself." "Close enough." Jake grinned, pulling a small device from his toolkit. "Hope you're not afraid of heights." The device was a plasma cutter, normally used for ship repairs. In Jake's hands it became a very effective way to redecorate the Crimson Fang's interior. He sliced through the deck plating like it was made of tissue paper, creating a hole large enough for their impromptu escape route. "Down we go," he called, jumping through the hole just as another wave of Vex's crew rounded the corner. Their blaster shots sizzled harmlessly through the space where he'd been standing a moment before. Zara gathered her cubs with the kind of efficiency that came from years of military training. "Hold tight, little ones," she murmured, then leaped through the hole with a grace that would make an Olympic gymnast weep with envy. They landed on the deck below in a corridor that looked like it had been decorated by someone with a serious grudge against good taste. Purple walls, orange ceiling, and what appeared to be mood lighting that was currently having a nervous breakdown. "This way," Jake pointed toward what looked like a maintenance shaft. "I may have mentioned that I'm really good at holding grudges. What I didn't mention is that I'm also really good at planning ahead." The maintenance shaft led them through the ship's bowels, past humming machinery and conduits that sparked with the kind of electrical problems that would make a safety inspector have nightmares. Jake had sabotaged more than just the obvious systems. He'd turned the entire ship into a ticking time bomb disguised as a transportation device. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Vex's crew was learning what humans had known for millennia: when you're really, really angry, you can accomplish impossible things. Like turning a routine maintenance job into a full-scale liberation operation. "The humans in the ventilation system," someone shouted. "He's like a particularly violent rat." "I prefer liberation specialist," Jake called back cheerfully. "But rat works too." They emerged from the shaft 2 decks up, right in the middle of what appeared to be the ship's recreational area. It was decorated with the kind of taste that suggested the interior designer had been drunk, blind, or possibly both. There were weapons mounted on the walls which Jake immediately began liberating for their cause. "Zara, you any good with a plasma rifle?" he asked, tossing her a weapon that looked like it could punch holes through small moons. "I was a commander in the defense force," she replied, checking the weapon's charge with professional efficiency. "I could hit a target with this thing while blindfolded and riding a bucking space whale." "Show off." Jake grinned, then his expression grew serious. "Escape pods are just ahead, but Vex is going to make one last play. He's not the type to let his prize merchandise walk away." As if summoned by his words, Captain Vex came crashing through the recreational area's main entrance. He'd apparently decided that subtlety was overrated and had brought what looked like half his remaining crew with him. The reptilian captain's eyes blazed with the kind of rage that came from watching your easy retirement fund turn into a very expensive funeral. "You miserable little meatbag." Vex roared, his voice echoing through the room like an angry thunderstorm. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me? That cat and her spawn were worth more than your entire pathetic species." Jake stepped forward, and for a moment something shifted in his expression. The easygoing maintenance worker facade dropped away, revealing something that made even Vex pause. This was the face of someone who'd seen too much suffering, freed too many slaves, and had finally reached the point where diplomacy was off the table. "Here's the thing about humans, Vex," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute certainty. "We're not actually weak. We're just really, really good at pretending to be harmless until it's too late for you to do anything about it." The plasma rifle in his hands wasn't pointing at Vex yet, but the threat was clear. "You want to know what you've cost yourself? Everything. Your ship, your crew, your reputation, and in about 30 seconds your life." Vex's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. "You think you can threaten me, human? I've conquered worlds. I've enslaved entire species. I am Captain Vex of the Crimson Fang, and I will not be intimidated by some primitive boring." Zara interrupted, and put a plasma bolt right between his eyes. The great Captain Vex, terror of the shipping lanes and nightmare of the innocent, toppled backward with a surprised expression that suggested he'd never quite processed the concept of his own mortality. His crew stared in shock at their fallen leader, then at the 7-foot alien warrior who was now pointing a plasma rifle at them with the kind of professional competence that suggested she'd done this before. "Anyone else want to discuss the superiority of their species?" she asked politely. The remaining crew members suddenly discovered they had urgent business elsewhere, preferably several star systems away. "Well," Jake said, checking his chronometer, "that was refreshing, but we should probably get going. The hyperdrive's about to have what you might call a catastrophic malfunction." As if on cue, the ship's engines began making the kind of noise that suggested they were trying to power a small galaxy and failing spectacularly. The lights flickered, the deck vibrated, and somewhere in the distance, alarms began wailing with the enthusiasm of a particularly melodramatic opera singer. "Time to go," Jake shouted, leading them toward the escape pods. "And just so you know, this is the part where everything explodes." They reached the pod bay just as the first series of explosions rocked the ship. the Crimson Fang, pride of the slaver fleet and testament to reptilian engineering, was coming apart at the seams. Jake's sabotage had turned the hyperdrive into the galaxy's most expensive firework. Everyone in. Jake called, herding Zara and the cubs into the nearest escape pod. Next stop, freedom. The pod launched just as the Crimson Fang's hyperdrive decided to demonstrate the difference between controlled fusion and uncontrolled annihilation. The explosion lit up the void like a small star, and somewhere in the distance, the other slave ships in Vex's fleet were getting a very clear message about what happened to people who thought humans were harmless. Beautiful, Zara murmured, watching the fireworks through the pod's viewport. Absolutely beautiful. Just wait until you see what comes next, Jake said, activating the pod's emergency beacon. The real show is just getting started. The rescue ship that appeared out of nowhere looked like it had been designed by someone with a serious appreciation for both functionality and flair. It was sleek, fast, and covered in so many weapon systems that it could probably take on a small fleet and win. But what really caught Zara's attention was the name painted across its hull in bold letters: Human Compassion. That's either the most ironic ship name in the galaxy, she said, or humans have a very different definition of compassion than the rest of us. Little bit of both, Jake admitted as their escape pod was drawn into the ship's docking bay. We tend to be very compassionate toward people who deserve it, and very educational toward people who don't. The docking bay was a revelation. It wasn't just a ship, it was a floating sanctuary. Zara counted at least a dozen different species moving around the bay, all of them with the kind of purposeful energy that came from people who'd found something worth fighting for. There were the blue-skinned Altarians who'd been enslaved for their psychic abilities, the crystalline Zephyrites who'd been hunted for their ability to process raw energy, and what looked like a family of the notoriously peaceful Verdanians who'd apparently decided that pacifism had its limits. Welcome aboard the Human Compassion, Jake said as they stepped out of the pod. Current population 237 liberated beings, 15 reformed pirates, 3 former slavers who found religion, and 1 very grumpy medical officer who insists that humans are too reckless for their own good. A tall, dark-skinned woman with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention approached them. She wore a captain's uniform that looked like it had seen more action than a war correspondent, and her eyes held the kind of warmth that came from someone who dedicated her life to making the universe a better place. Captain Nina Torres, she introduced herself to Zara with a slight bow. Jake's told me a lot about you. Welcome to the rebellion. The rebellion? Zara asked, settling her cubs more comfortably in her arms. They were staring wide-eyed at all the different species around them, their little minds probably trying to process the fact that the universe was much bigger and stranger than they'd ever imagined. Oh, did Jake not mention that part? Captain Torres smiled, and there was something in that smile that would have made Captain Vex very, very nervous if he'd still been alive to see it. Humans have been running a little side project for the past few years. We call it the Underground Railroad 2.0. Jake scratched his head with the kind of embarrassment that came from someone who'd been caught being more heroic than he'd intended. See, the thing is, slavery really bothers us. Like really bothers us. So we decided to do something about it. Something about it. Zara looked around the bay again, taking in the sheer scope of what she was seeing. How many ships do you have, currently? About 200, Torres replied casually. We've been busy. Turns out that when you give humans a cause they believe in, they get very creative very quickly. A small furry creature that looked like a cross between a teddy bear and a philosopher approached them. It wore a tiny lab coat and carried a medical scanner that was almost as big as it was. Dr. Pip, Jake introduced. Our chief medical officer. He's from Fluffington Prime, which is exactly as adorable as it sounds. Humans, Dr. Pip said in a voice that sounded like someone had fed helium to a university professor, are the most illogical species in the galaxy. They risk their lives for strangers. They form emotional attachments to beings they've never met, and they have an inexplicable tendency to adopt anything that looks remotely helpless. And yet, he continued, his tiny paws working efficiently to check the cubs for any signs of injury. They are also the most effective liberators the galaxy has ever seen. It's quite puzzling, really. It's not puzzling at all, said a voice from behind them. Zara turned to see a figure that made her do a double take. It was another human, but this one was clearly military. Everything about him, from his posture to his hair cut to the way he moved, screamed professional soldier. His uniform bore the insignia of what looked like a general. General Marcus Webb, he introduced himself. Formerly of the Terran Defense Force, currently of the Make Slavery Very Unprofitable Division. General, Zara said, her military training automatically kicking in. I'm Commander Zara of the Felinar Defense Force. Or I was, anyway. You still are, Webb replied firmly. We've been in contact with your government. They're very interested in joining our little crusade. Turns out that when you rescue a decorated war hero and her cubs from slavers, people tend to pay attention. Jake was grinning now, the kind of grin that came from someone who'd just pulled off the galaxy's most elaborate practical joke. Did I mention that this whole thing was kind of a recruitment mission? We've been trying to get the feline on board for months. Nothing says join our cause quite like a daring rescue. Zara stared at him. You mean you didn't just stumble across us? This was planned. Well, not the part where you got captured, Jake admitted. That was genuinely bad luck. But once we heard about it, we figured it was a perfect opportunity to show the galaxy what humans do when someone messes with our friends. Your friends? Zara asked. But we'd never met. Didn't matter, Captain Torres said simply. You were in trouble, you had children who needed help, and you were fighting against something we couldn't tolerate. That made you our friends automatically. Dr. Pip finished his examination of the cubs and pronounced them healthy but hungry. Typical human logic, he muttered, but there was affection in his voice. They'll risk everything to help complete strangers then act like it's the most natural thing in the world. Because it is, Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of conviction that came from absolute certainty. Look, the galaxy's got this idea that humans are weak because we're emotional. But here's what they don't understand. Emotions aren't a weakness. They're a strength. They're what make us care about things bigger than ourselves. And when humans care about something, General Webb added, they don't just complain about it, they fix it. Permanently. Zara looked around the bay again, taking in the rescued beings, the weapons, the ships, the sheer scale of what these humans had accomplished. How many slavers have you put out of business? All of them, Captain Torres replied matter-of-factly. In this sector anyway, we're working on the others. And how many beings have you freed? Stopped counting at 10,000, Jake said. Turns out that when you make slavery unprofitable and extremely dangerous, people tend to find other career paths. One of the cubs mewed softly, and Zara looked down to see all three of them staring up at Jake with the kind of adoration usually reserved for legendary heroes. Which, she was beginning to realize, he actually was. So what happens now? She asked. Now, General Webb said, you have a choice. You can go home to your family and your old life, with our blessing and our protection. Or you can join us and help make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Zara looked at her cubs, then at the humans who'd risked everything to save them, then at the other species who'd found hope in the most unlikely place. The choice really wasn't much of a choice at all. When do we start? She asked. Jake's grin could have powered a small star. Right now. Because somewhere out there there's another family that needs our help. And humans, as it turns out, are really good at helping. As the human compassion jumped to hyperspace, heading toward their next mission, Zara reflected on the galaxy's biggest misconception. Humans weren't weak because they were emotional. They were dangerous because they were emotional. And when they decided to care about something, they didn't just make a difference. They made everything different.